It's Quick Art Talk time, episode 26. Mikael Koos speaking. The devil's in the detail, that's today's topic. Before I start, I would like to make it sure to you guys that all these tips and pointers are separate from our advanced and extensive teachings at school. However, it is still, of course, our intention, and we are always very eager to provide you with some brief tips, knowledge pointers, and, overall kind of knowledge that might aid you in your concept art and or illustration journey. That being said, before I start, I would like to also say something about this artwork that is being taken care of. It's pre-recorded, part of a personal project I've been developing since 2014. It's a resistant fighter Polish airplane. I on purpose didn't put the whole plane on the canvas because I was making it in mind with today's topic. I am focusing basically on a portion of that airplane so I can spend that time on a little bit more detail, right? So with that being said, you can see that every image has its own goal. And this is beautiful in art, that we can really creatively tackle a lot of subject matters, even when we're going through, for example, an environment or an architectural piece like you will do in Direct's class, for example, or when you're going through a hardware piece like this, you can really communicate. You are the decision maker, what the viewer needs to be focused on. And in this specific example, I am focusing on the frontal part of the airplane. It's kind of twisted, it has kind of this poster kind of look, meaning that it could, be kind of some kind of propaganda poster, it's just that portion of the airplane, focused, big canvas, it's filling up the whole canvas, and it is portraying and conveying a certain emotion like we often try to do with concept art, right? And illustration. Let's go over the pointers. As always, we have a limited amount of time, so I always kind of am tempted to go into detail in every point, get it into detail, talking about detail. So I'm not going to try to talk too much about detail and not to go so much into detail while talking about it. Does that make sense? Right, it's becoming a tongue twister. Let's start. What is detail overall? So detail, I think, really starts in what kind of medium you're portraying it, what kind of brush strokes you're using. Are you doing it with charcoal, pencil, fine liners? That is already that detail that we talk about, right? Why are you making a certain decision? What is your goal of the painting? What is the style? That is on a very, very broad spectrum. On a bottlenecked scale, it's kind of a new term, I guess, I'm coming up with. But on a micromanagement scale, detail is what constitutes the believability and richness, especially in concept art, I would believe. You want to kind of elevate your artwork with complementary detail in order to make it more convincing for the audience. Detail is a very important part and is a very, very crucial element of, the picture as a whole. Therefore, you have, for example, the major shapes that, for example, you see with this airplane. However, the richness and convincing the viewer that we are talking about an airplane that could really, really exist, we have to also take the detail into consideration. And that is part of the synthesis that together, again, fits and completes the entire entity. It's a whole connected whole. The details, the main forms, and everything in between, right, needs to just work perfectly. So this is what would constitute the detail overall. Let's go to the next point, and this is a pretty difficult one because, well, our students struggle with it. I struggle with it. I know that Darek also struggles with it. I think every professional concept artist still struggles with it because it is an ongoing journey. And here is the thing, how to make detail realistic. When we're talking about realism in concept art, we often want to reach that goal of believability and richness and realism. However, if you also are aware of our previous episodes, I talked that there is no such thing as realistic artwork, right? It's very tricky. And the reason for that is that it's always a reinterpretation of reality. When an artist is working creatively, he or she perceives the world as it is through her or her eyes, and then filters it through their own system, their own experience, their own skill level. They choose consciously or sometimes subconsciously what to include in their artwork, what to exaggerate, what to omit, what to skip. That together forms a whole style, of course. And how to make it realistic? Well, I would say that you really, really have to, again, look at the real world. I know it's a reoccurring topic, but being an effective observer of the real world will always give you the upper hand against your competition, so to speak. So I would really begin with, for example, before designing my own airplane, like I do here, even though it's really much inspired by the original Spitfire, on a sub-design level, it is a completely different design. And the sub-design level is out of what details it is being formed in order to create a fresh new design. Because the main form factor, as you can see, is still, that of a World War II airplane fighter. So again, look at the real world, be an observer, study it thoroughly, and you might really take it for granted how much detail there is in our world and how amazing it is to become an observer that is really aware of her or his environment. For example, we often give this example in class. You might say that, I am observer. I do observe all the time, I look at cars. Yeah, but do you really look at cars? Do you know what happens if you take a wheel off a car, for example? What kind of mechanisms are taking place when you take off that wheel? Oh, I look at churches and I look at houses. Yeah, do you look at houses, or do you actually also research its history, out of what materials they do consist? When and how have they been built? By what kind of culture they've been inspired by? It's all very important. This will help you to get better in detail. And in class we give not only better example, but we explain why it happens, how to do it, and how to apply it on a vast array of topics, right? So I hope that makes things a little bit more clearer. Let's quickly check the time. All right, let's go further. Under the point of how to use detail realistically, I would also add a sub-point to this. And this is the complexity versus breathing spaces. Now, in this example, of course, you see again a hardware piece from me, because I'm responsible at school for the hardware design classes, both intro and advanced. Darek is taking care of the environment classes, also both intro and advanced. And we both run the digital painting classes, just so you know. However, what I'm about to say really is applicable through, a vast spectrum. So vehicles, environments, characters. And again, that is the fact that we have to take into consideration how detail is being kind of spread out through a certain design. And every design has it. Every successful design needs to have kind of a breathing space where detail is accumulated and where there is a restful area. Now, in this example, just to make things clear, you can see that detail is accumulated around the cockpit area. Then I consciously picked to make the exhaust area on the frontal side of the plane also a little bit more complex than any original airplane. You can see that right now on the right side there is a German Messerschmitt, and it also has exhaust, but it is smaller. It is not as much put in your face, whereas I consciously picked in this case to exaggerate that detail because I want to communicate a certain emotion that it is, kind of a robust, more chunky looking airplane, and perhaps it had some engine modifications, because I'm trying here as well to tell a certain story, which is that, the Poles are using these British airplanes, but for their own needs, they're kind of like tuning them, customizing them, bigger exhausts, bigger air intakes, for example, for better performance output. So that is extremely important, because often what we tend to see with upcoming students or people that are just joining our school is that they think that the more detailed, the better, right? I'm like, oh, I'm adding the detail to hide maybe certain mistakes. Don't use detail for that. Make always sure that your detail makes sense and that it is distributed nicely. Why should you distribute it nicely between open breathing spaces and complex spaces where detail is accumulated? Well, again, I don't want to extensively explain that. I keep that energy for the class, but to give you a nice quick tip on that is because it's the uniform kind of law of a good design. The whole design philosophy as a whole constitutes that the detail should not be spread around equally. Well, there are exceptions to the rule because, of course, it's art. But almost every successful design that I've seen consists of kind of this synthesis where you have spaces with no detail or little detail and then points of accumulated detail. That guides the eye across a design very nicely. And as an artist, you have to be very, very aware of that and keep that in mind. However, your audience subconsciously just enjoys your art, and they will not know all the factors that we're talking about now. We are tapping into what is pleasing for the eye to see, and it will be pleasing for the eye to see for the general audience. Concept artists need to know how to manipulate with these things, how to manipulate with these aspects. So you can see breathing spaces around the panels, right? Like the panels, they are just like cut lines and there is not much detail. I'm not exaggerating with the amount of bolts or mechanics that are sticking out. But then again, the air intake under the nose is detailed. Then the exhaust on the side is chunky and detailed and showcases some mechanical complexity, and then there is complexity around the cockpit, because that's how I want to guide the eye. The cockpit is, as well in this case, kind of also the face of this vehicle, all right? So I hope that it makes things a little bit more clear. Let's go now to the next point, which covers detail in concept art specifically. Detail in concept art specifically really, I think, relies on the literal aspect. Now, what do I kind of mean by that? We talked previously about, well, that detail can constitute, with what kind of medium you're painting, what is the focus when you're using your artistic brushstrokes, right? That is a very emotional aspect within art. In concept art, we use art as a medium, as a tool to communicate our ideas. When we talk about the details specifically for concept art, we are more talking about how to make our designs or set pieces, environments, architecture more believable and rich. And here comes to play, kind of the knowledge that we need as a concept designer, again, to have the awareness of how the real world works and how things in the real world works. So again, for example, I do need some basic knowledge on aviation when it comes to designing an airplane like this. I need to know some of the manufacturing technologies which were employed during that era specifically. So we're talking about technical level. How are things manufactured? How is the steel on this airplane, these aluminum alloyed panels, how are they being constructed? Do you guys even think about it? As a concept artist, you do have to think about it. What is machining versus welding versus riveted armor, for example? How are the materials corroding or weathering over time? We all know that metal rusts, and most metals, kind of the relatability that we have with rust is that rust is reddish, yellowish. However, an airplane is mainly made out of aluminum. And aluminum doesn't rust in your normal way like, for example, iron. It will not corrode in red or yellow. It will kind of have this white matte layer being kind of put on the main surface. So knowing these things will help you with the richness and believability. And you can see how quickly we can dive into this kind of detail. Now, there is, of course, it's not, of course, limited to hardware design. When it comes to architecture, that's the same thing. On what kind of world is your architectural piece based on? When you are joining, for example, the class with Darek Zaborodzki, you will have a profound amount of knowledge about the architectural styles, the manufacturing aspect, the technology level, what materials were used, every environment. Every civilization has a different set of materials to their disposal, which in return results how their buildings and architectural pieces will be shaped, right? So it's all very important. You can see that concept art is a job where we often think of that is maybe, easy, just know how to draw. However, you do need a little bit of knowledge from everywhere, I would say. When you're designing, for example, designs for a game like Call of Duty, you need a different set of knowledge than when you're designing for a medieval typed game, fantasy themed game like The Witcher, for example. However, the design philosophy on detail remains the same when we look to the points above, right? And so slowly but steadily, we're coming to an end. But as always, there is this last point, this last nagging point, that kind of realization check, which always haunts us almost in every quick Art Talk Time episode. And that is, you guessed it, the importance of fundamentals. Now, some people, some artists, and we've seen it again, students are coming in, and when they come out, it's always such a satisfaction to see them improve. But sometimes, and I am guilty of it too, I thought that with enough detail, if I just spend a lot of time and just, really add that richness and believability, I will save an artwork. I will save my design. Well, that cannot be true. Your foundation of every design, illustration, environmental piece, character needs to be solid, because that is your skeleton. That is your spine. That is your frame. And if the frame is not solid, if the frame has solid fundamental flaws, it will collapse no matter what, no matter how many fancy details you're going to put onto it. It's like comparing it to a building, right? You're making a building, it consists of cornerstones, also some kind of frame maybe. And if that is flawed and you just, make beautiful aesthetical things around it with, beautiful ornaments, well, if the building eventually collapses because of a flawed frame, then the details don't matter. And with art, that is the same case. And I think I can only speak from a point of view of concept art, because I am a concept artist. And so I found it out the hard way, and it took me a lot of years to realize what the beautiful balance is between detail, complexity, etc. Detail is never a main tool that saves your design. Your design should already suggestively carry the essence of a successful design, whereas the detail comes in a complementary way. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. When I would, for example, design the engine alone of this aircraft, then the main shapes become less important, but then the complexity and the believability of all the details of an engine become more important. However, most of the time we are working on a design as a whole, on a set piece as a whole, and for that we need solid main shapes and very strong fundamentals. As you can see, it just cannot be ignored. When it comes to, we can also dissect it into kind of subpoints for you to have a clearer understanding. Well, I would say that we have environments, hardware, and characters in concept art, and of course there are more. There are of course more branches. You have, weapon concept artists or only prop artists. However, for example, for environments, it is the importance that you know how landscape, for example, is corroding. How are stones and rock formations being formed? How would a logical piece of architecture would take place in such an environment? You all have to need that kind of knowledge. What kind of vegetation? What is the color of the plants? How they all uniformly come together. When you're just making a tower, a beautiful castle tower on top of a hill, think about how it was built. What is the pathway? Why did they decide to make a tower there in the first place, right? So make it really rich and believable. Why did people bother to carry all the materials there on top of that hill, right? Making a tower in a canyon would not make much sense. So you have to have this kind of reality check. And that is also part of, detail, basically. These details really matter. When it comes to hardware, well, here in this example, you can see that I am making this concept rich and believable by implementing certain style of bolts, paneling, and the mechanisms, right? There is a certain style of layering going on, what we call in concept art, meaning that we have different materials intersecting with each other and layered within each other or on top of each other. So we have the mechanical detail, which has like this dark gray purplish hue going on, which consists of the air intake and the side exhaust that you can see right now. Then we have the main body frame, right, which composes most of the body. And then we have the glass, which is just a tiny exit around the cockpit. And again, the type of material here in this case can increase the complexity of detail. I will let this work take care of itself, as it is going to be finished in a minute or two. I would like to thank you for watching. Like and subscribe as always. It really helps us out. And let us know in the comments what you would like to see next. And yeah, it's just time to wrap up. It really appears that we are out of time. Until the next one, and bye.